June 28, 2024. That was the day the United States blinked. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no generals in war rooms, no televised ultimatums, no last-minute diplomatic shuttle. Just a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the White House's tone. After years of crippling sanctions, covert regime change operations, and thinly veiled threats of military intervention, the Biden administration suddenly softened its stance on Venezuela. Not just a little. A lot. The Treasury Department eased oil sanctions. The State Department hinted at reopening diplomatic channels. And most tellingly, the U.S. government, long the chief architect of Venezuela's isolation, began treating Nicolas Maduro not as a pariah, but as a legitimate interlocutor. If you were only following the mainstream narrative, you'd think this was just another case of pragmatic diplomacy. Venezuela's economy is in shambles, its people are fleeing by the millions, and Maduro's government is as authoritarian as ever. So why the sudden détente? The official line is that the U.S. is rewarding democratic progress after Maduro's government allowed limited opposition participation in last year's elections. The New York Times called it a calculated gamble. The Washington Post framed it as a test of engagement. The White House press secretary described it as a step in the right direction. But here's the problem with that: it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. I've spent the last 2 decades studying the intersection of energy geopolitics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. And what's happening in Venezuela right now isn't about democracy. It's about something far more consequential, a seismic shift in the global balance of power, one that Washington is only now beginning to grasp. The U.S. isn't suddenly going soft on Maduro because it wants to. It's doing it because, for the first time in a generation, it has to. Let me tell you why. The official what they want you to believe. The story goes like after years of economic warfare, the U.S. finally got through to Maduro. The sanctions worked. The pressure paid off. Venezuela's 2024 elections, while flawed, were at least less fraudulent than previous ones. The opposition was allowed to participate, some political prisoners were released, and Maduro even signaled a willingness to negotiate. In response, the Biden administration, ever the pragmatist, decided to ease up. A carrot and stick reward good behavior, keep the stick ready if Maduro backslides. The data seems to support this. Venezuela's oil production, which had collapsed under U.S. sanctions, ticked up slightly in early 2024. Inflation, while still catastrophic, slowed from its hyperinflationary peak. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control issued new licenses allowing limited oil exports to Europe and Asia. And in a move that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago, the U.S. even sent a high-level delegation to Caracas for talks, no preconditions, no ultimatums. The media played along. CNN ran segments on Venezuela's slow path to democracy. The Wall Street Journal published op-eds arguing that engagement, not isolation, is the way forward. Even some human rights groups, long critical of Maduro, cautiously welcomed the shift. The message was America was being reasonable. Maduro was being pragmatic. Progress was possible. But here's where the story starts to unravel. First, the democratic progress is a mirage. Yes, the opposition was allowed to run in the 2024 elections, but only after the most popular opposition candidate, Maria Corina Machado, was banned from participating. Yes, some political prisoners were released, but hundreds remain, and new arrests continue. And yes, Maduro allowed limited international observation, but the election itself was still marred by irregularities, intimidation, and outright fraud in key states. If this is what the U.S. considers progress, then Washington's standards for democracy have hit rock bottom. Second, the economic data doesn't support the narrative that sanctions worked. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013. More than 7 million people have fled the country. The bolivar is worthless. The oil industry, once the backbone of the economy, is a shadow of its former self. Sanctions didn't force Maduro to the negotiating table, they broke Venezuela's economy, and in the process, they pushed Maduro into the arms of America's adversaries. Which brings us to the third, and most glaring, problem with the official Maduro isn't desperate. He's stronger than he's been in years. The hidden why Maduro isn't going anywhere. Let's start with the most inconvenient truth for Venezuela's oil is still flowing, and it's flowing to China and Russia. In 2023, Venezuela exported over 600,000 barrels of oil per day, despite U.S. sanctions. Most of it went to China, which has become Venezuela's largest trading partner. Beijing doesn't care about human rights or democracy. It cares about energy security and geopolitical leverage. And right now, Venezuela is a critical piece of both. Russia, too, has doubled down on its support for Maduro. In 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, Moscow sent military advisors to Venezuela to help prop up the regime. Russian oil companies, like Rosneft, have taken over key energy projects that Western firms abandoned. And in a move that should have set off alarm bells in Washington, Russia and Venezuela signed a new military cooperation agreement in 2023, one that includes joint naval exercises in the Caribbean. Here's what's really: the U.S. sanctions regime didn't isolate Venezuela. It reoriented it. For years, Washington assumed that if it squeezed Venezuela hard enough, Maduro would either collapse or capitulate. But that calculation ignored two critical. 1. Maduro has alternative patrons. China and Russia don't just provide economic lifelines, they provide political cover. When the U.S. tried to rally international support for regime change at the UN, China and Russia vetoed it. When the U.S. imposed secondary sanctions on companies doing business with Venezuela, China and Russia simply ignored them. And when the U.S. tried to starve Venezuela of foreign currency, China and Russia stepped in with loans, trade deals, and barter arrangements. 2. Sanctions strengthen Maduro's grip on power. Economic crises don't always lead to regime change. In fact, they often consolidate authoritarian rule. When people are struggling to survive, they don't have the luxury of protesting. When the opposition is divided and discredited, the regime can afford to be more repressive. And when the U.S. is seen as the primary cause of the country's suffering, anti-Americanism becomes a unifying force. The result? Maduro is more entrenched than ever. And now, with China and Russia backing him, he has no incentive to make real concessions. So why is the U.S. suddenly playing nice? Because the alternative, continuing to squeeze Venezuela while China and Russia prop it up, is a losing game. And in the new multipolar world, losing games are the ones that get you isolated, not your adversaries. The geopolitical how Venezuela became untouchable. To understand why Venezuela is suddenly untouchable, you have to way out. We're living through the death of the unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War when the US was the sole superpower, able to dictate terms to the rest of the world. That era is over. What we're seeing now is the rise of a multipolar order, where power is distributed among multiple the US, China, Russia, and regional blocs like the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Venezuela is a perfect case study in how this new order works. For China, Venezuela is a strategic energy asset. China imports over 10 million barrels of oil per day, and it's desperate to reduce its dependence on Middle Eastern supply chains. Venezuela, with the world's largest proven oil reserves, is a critical part of that diversification strategy. But it's not just about oil. China sees Venezuela as a foothold in America's backyard, a way to project influence in a region that Washington has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. For Russia, Venezuela is a geopolitical pressure point. Moscow knows that the U.S. is stretched thin militarily, economically, and politically. By propping up Maduro, Russia forces the U.S. to divert resources and attention to a country that, on paper, shouldn't matter much to American security. It's a classic asymmetric strategy: make your adversary bleed in places where they can't win. And for the U.S.? Venezuela is a symbol of imperial overreach. For 2 decades, Washington has treated Latin America as its playground. Regime change in Honduras? No problem. Coups in Bolivia? Business as usual. Sanctions on Cuba? Old news. But now, with China and Russia pushing back, the US is learning a hard you can't sanction your way to dominance when your adversaries don't play by the same rules. Let me be, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the new rules of the game. In the old world, the US could impose sanctions, freeze assets, and expect compliance. In the new world, countries like China and Russia simply create parallel financial systems that bypass US control. In the old world, the US could isolate a country like Venezuela and expect it to collapse. In the new world, that country just pivots to new partners who don't care about human rights or democracy. This is what I've been warning about for the weaponization of interdependence. The US thought it could use its financial and economic dominance as a tool of coercion. But in doing so, it accelerated the search for alternatives. And now, those alternatives exist. Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine. If the US can't bend a country like Venezuela to its will despite years of sanctions, covert ops, and diplomatic pressure, then what does that say about American power in the 21st century? The military-wide intervention is a fantasy. Now, some of you might be if sanctions aren't working, why not just invade? After all, the US has a long history of regime change operations in Latin America. Guatemala in 1954. Chile in 1973. AMA in 1989. Haiti in 1994. And let's not forget the 2002 coup attempt against Hugo Chavez, which the US almost certainly supported. But here's the hard: military intervention in Venezuela is a non-starter. Let's break it down. First, the military balance has shifted. Venezuela's armed forces are no longer the ragtag outfit they were in the 1990s. Thanks to Russian and Chinese support, they've been modernized. Venezuela now has advanced air defense systems, Russian-made tanks, and even hypersonic missiles. The US could still win a conventional war, but it wouldn't be quick or easy. And in an era where public support for foreign wars is at an all-time low, that's a political non-starter. Second, the regional dynamics have changed. In the 1980s, the US could count on Latin American governments to support intervention. Today? Not a chance. Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina have all made it clear that they oppose military action in Venezuela. Even Colombia, which has a long history of cooperation with the US, has ruled out hosting American troops for an invasion. Why? Because Latin America is tired of being treated as America's backyard. Third, the strategic risks are too high. Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a key US ally. An invasion would risk destabilizing the entire region. And let's not Venezuela has allies. Russia has already warned that it would respond to any US military action. China, while less likely to intervene directly, would almost certainly ramp up its support for Maduro. And Iran, which has deepened its ties with Venezuela in recent years, would see an opportunity to extend its influence in the Western Hemisphere. Finally, the domestic political costs are prohibitive. The American public is exhausted by forever wars. The last thing Biden or any president wants is another Iraq or Afghanistan. And with the 2024 election looming, the last thing the White House needs is a foreign policy disaster. So no, the US isn't going to invade Venezuela. And that's why Maduro is suddenly untouchable. The domestic political why Venezuela is a swing state issue. But geopolitics isn't the only reason the US is backing off. There's also a domestic political dimension, one that's often overlooked. Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy issue. It's a Florida issue. Florida is the ultimate swing state. It's home to over 2 million Venezuelan Americans, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. And in a state where elections are decided by razor-thin margins, the Venezuelan vote matters a lot. In 2020, Trump won Florida by just 371,000 votes. The Venezuelan American community, which leans heavily Republican, was a key part of that victory. And in 2024, with the race expected to be even closer, both parties are desperate to win over this bloc. The problem for Biden? His base hates Maduro, but his foreign policy team knows that regime change is a fantasy. So what do you do when you're caught between a rock and a hard place? You pretend to be tough while quietly backing down. That's exactly what we're seeing now. The Biden administration is making symbolic gestures, like keeping some sanctions in place and occasionally criticizing Maduro, to appease the Venezuelan American community. But behind it's a delicate balancing act. And it's one that's likely to fail. Because here's the Maduro knows he's untouchable. He knows that the US can invade. He knows that China and Russia have his back. And he knows that, as long as he doesn't cross certain red lines, the US will have to deal with him. So why would he make real concessions? He won't. And that's the trap the US has walked into. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this leave us? Let's game out the most likely scenarios. Scenario 1: the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela enter a cold peace. The US eases some sanctions, but keeps others in place as leverage. Maduro allows limited opposition participation in future elections, but ensures that the regime remains in control. Venezuela's oil flows to China and Russia, but some also makes its way to the US and Europe under tightly controlled conditions. This is the most likely outcome, because it's the one that requires the least effort from all parties. The US can claim it's engaging without having to admit defeat. Maduro can claim he's resisting imperialism while quietly reaping the benefits of sanctions relief. And China and Russia can continue to exert their influence without triggering a direct confrontation with the US. The downside? It's unstable. Venezuela's economy will remain in crisis. The opposition will remain divided. And the risk of another mass exodus, one that could destabilize Colombia, Peru, and the US itself, will persist. Scenario 2: the slow-motion collapse. In this scenario, Venezuela's economy continues to deteriorate, but Maduro refuses to make real reforms. The US reimposes sanctions, but China and Russia step in with even more support. Venezuela becomes a fully fledged client state of Beijing and Moscow, hosting Russian military bases in Chinese economic zones. This is the nightmare scenario for the US, because it turns Venezuela into a permanent geopolitical thorn. The US would be forced to either accept a Russian and Chinese presence in its backyard or risk a direct confrontation. The only thing preventing this scenario? Maduro's survival instinct. He knows that if he becomes too dependent on China and Russia, he risks losing control of his own country. So he'll likely try to play all sides, taking help from China and Russia while keeping the door open to the US. Scenario 3: the Black Swan. This is the wildcard scenario, the one no one sees coming. It could be a military coup. It could be a mass uprising. Or it could be a direct US-Russia confrontation. The most plausible black swan? A Russian military base in Venezuela. If Moscow decides to deploy long-range bombers or nuclear-capable missiles to Venezuela, the US would be forced to respond. And that response could escalate into a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. This scenario is unlikely, but it's not zero. And in a multipolar world, the risk of miscalculation is higher than ever. The grand strategy why America keeps losing. At its core, the Venezuela crisis is a symptom of a much larger the failure of American grand strategy. For the past 3 decades, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its unrivaled power to reshape the world in its image. Regime change. Democracy promotion. Economic coercion. Military intervention. And what has it gotten us? A failed state, a breeding ground for terrorism, and a strategic victory for Iran. A 20-year war that ended with the Taliban back in power. A collapsed state and a migrant crisis that destabilized Europe. A forever war that strengthened Russia and Iran. A proxy war that has drained US resources and emboldened China. And now, a country that has become the latest proving ground for American impotence. Venezuela isn't just a policy failure, it's a strategic humiliation. And the worst part? The US keeps making the same mistakes, as if the last 30 years of blowback never happened. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine for a much larger geopolitical shift, one where the US is no longer the sole superpower but one of several competing powers in a multipolar world. The problem isn't just that Washington's Venezuela policy has failed. The problem is that Washington doesn't seem to understand why it failed, or worse, that it's incapable of adapting. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US has been here before. In 2002, the Bush administration tacitly supported a coup against Hugo Chavez, only to watch it collapse in 48 hours. In 2004, the CIA's own postmortem concluded that the coup failed because the US misread Venezuelan society, assuming that the opposition's elite support translated into mass legitimacy. Sound familiar? Fast forward to 2019, when Juan Guaidó was anointed as Venezuela's interim president with US backing, only to see his movement wither under the weight of its own contradictions. The US bet on a political outsider with no real power base, no military support, and no coherent plan beyond Maduro must go. And when that failed, Washington doubled down, imposing sanctions that hurt ordinary Venezuelans far more than the regime, while Maduro tightened his grip with Russian and Chinese help. Here's the uncomfortable: the US keeps treating Venezuela as a problem to be solved, when in reality, it's a reality to be managed. The establishment narrative, whether from the State Department, the think tanks, or the op-ed pages, still clings to the idea that if we just apply enough pressure, the regime will collapse. But regimes don't collapse on demand. They adapt. And Maduro has adapted brilliantly, turning US sanctions into a propaganda tool, portraying himself as a David against the American Goliath, while quietly selling off Venezuela's future to China and Russia. The military implications of this are profound. Venezuela today is not just a failed state, it's a militarized one. The country has the largest oil reserves in the world, but its military is now one of the most heavily armed in Latin America, thanks to Russian and Chinese hardware. Since 2005, Venezuela has spent over $11 billion on Russian arms, including Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. In 2019, Russia deployed 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela in a show of force, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington. The message was: if the US pushes too hard, Moscow can push back right in America's backyard. And that's the real danger. The US has spent decades treating Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence, but Russia and China have spent the last 20 years chipping away at that dominance. Venezuela is just the most visible example. Russia has military cooperation agreements with Nicaragua, Cuba, and Bolivia. China has invested over $160 billion in Latin America since 2005, becoming the region's top trading partner. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, but Washington still acts like it's alive. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the: what happens if the US decides to use military force? The short answer: it would be a disaster. Venezuela's military is battle-hardened from years of suppressing protests and fighting cartels. Its Russian-supplied air defenses would make any US airstrikes risky. And even if the US succeeded in toppling Maduro, what then? The country is a powder keg. A post-Maduro Venezuela could descend into civil war, with armed colectivos, drug cartels, and rogue military factions fighting for control. The US would inherit another failed state, another Afghanistan, another Iraq. But here's the US doesn't need to invade Venezuela to lose. It's already losing by default. Every time Washington imposes new sanctions, Maduro turns to Russia and China for lifelines. Every time the US backs an opposition figure with no real support, it undermines its own credibility. And every time the US threatens military action but doesn't follow through, it emboldens its adversaries. So what's the alternative? The first step is admitting that the old playbook doesn't work. Regime change isn't a strategy, it's a fantasy. Sanctions aren't a silver bullet, they're a double-edged sword. And military intervention isn't a solution, it's a last resort that should never be on the table. The second step is recognizing that Venezuela is no longer just a bilateral issue. It's a geopolitical chessboard, and the US is playing checkers. Russia and China aren't just propping up Maduro out of altruism, they're doing it because Venezuela is a strategic asset. For Russia, it's a way to project power into the Western Hemisphere. For China, it's a source of oil and a foothold in a region that the US has long considered its own. The US can't counter this with sanctions alone. It needs a real strategy, one that acknowledges the limits of American power and the realities of a multipolar world. That means engaging with Venezuela on terms that don't involve surrender but don't require regime change either. It means offering sanctions relief in exchange for real concessions, like free elections or the release of political prisoners. It means working with allies in Latin America to isolate Maduro diplomatically, not just economically. And it means accepting that Venezuela will remain a problem for the foreseeable future, but one that can be managed, not solved. The third step is that the US needs to stop seeing every crisis as an opportunity to reassert its dominance. The era of unipolarity is over. The world is messy, and America's adversaries are playing a long game. Russia and China don't need to win in Venezuela, they just need the US to keep losing. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. Venezuela isn't untouchable because it's strong. It's untouchable because the US has run out of good options. And until Washington accepts that, it will keep stumbling from one crisis to the next, leaving its adversaries to fill the vacuum. The question isn't whether the US can afford to ignore Venezuela. The question is whether it can afford to keep pretending it has the answers. Now, what most people don't realize is that this paralysis in Washington isn't just about geopolitics, it's about domestic politics too. Venezuela's untouchability isn't just a story of great power competition, it's also a story of how Maduro has turned his own country into a fortress of survival, one that even his enemies can't crack without risking their own stability. And that's where the real story gets interesting. Let me explain why this matters. For years, the narrative in the US has been that Maduro is a weak dictator, clinging to power only because of repression and foreign backing. But that's a dangerous oversimplification. The truth is, Maduro has done something far more. He's made himself indispensable to the very system that keeps Venezuela afloat. He's not just a leader, he's the linchpin of a patronage network that stretches from the military to the oil fields to the slums of Caracas. And that network isn't just loyal to him, it's dependent on him. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's military isn't just a tool of repression, it's a parallel state. The generals don't just enforce Maduro's rule, they profit from it. Take the case of Tarek el-Aissami, the former vice president and oil minister who was sanctioned by the US for drug trafficking. Or Diosdado Cabello, the National Assembly president and former military officer who's been accused of running a criminal empire within the state. These aren't just Maduro's cronies, they're the backbone of a system where loyalty is bought with access to dollars, oil contracts, and protection from prosecution. And that system doesn't just survive because of fear, it survives because it works for them. Now, you might: if the military is so corrupt, why hasn't there been a coup? The answer is simple. A coup would require a faction of the military to believe they'd be better off without Maduro. But Maduro has made sure that no one faction is strong enough to challenge him and that anyone who tries would risk losing everything. Remember the 2019 attempted uprising led by Juan Guaidó and a handful of defecting soldiers? It failed because the military's top brass never fully committed. And why would they? The status quo is lucrative. The U.S. Treasury estimates that Venezuela's military controls up to 40% of the country's food imports and a significant chunk of its oil exports. That's not just power, that's a business. And businesses don't stage coups unless they're sure they'll win. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Maduro's survival isn't just about the military, it's about the people who still depend on the state. Venezuela's economy has collapsed, but the government still employs about 2.5 million people, according to the Venezuelan Observatory of Public Sector Employment. That's nearly 20% of the working-age population. And while most of those jobs pay next to nothing in bolivars, they come with access to subsidized food, housing, and most importantly, dollars through the government's parallel exchange system. For millions of Venezuelans, the state isn't just a source of repression, it's a lifeline. And that's why, despite the misery, Maduro still has a base of support that goes beyond the military. It's not love, it's survival. Now, let's talk about the opposition. For years, the US and its allies have bet on Juan Guaidó as the face of Venezuela's democratic resistance. But Guaidó's moment has passed, and here's he was never more than a symbol. The opposition in Venezuela is fractured, and Guaidó's legitimacy was always more about international recognition than domestic support. The 2020 parliamentary elections, which the opposition boycotted, were a disaster for them. Maduro's allies won a supermajority in the National Assembly, and Guaido's interim government became a ghost, recognized by the US and its allies but increasingly irrelevant at home. The opposition's biggest mistake was believing that international pressure alone could force Maduro out. It couldn't. And now, they're paying the price. So where does that leave us? Let's look at the scenarios. The most likely one is what I call the zombie state. Venezuela limps along, neither collapsing nor recovering. Maduro stays in power, the economy remains in shambles, and the country becomes a permanent crisis, one that the US and its allies can't ignore but can't fix either. The sanctions will stay in place, but they won't bring Maduro down. The military will remain loyal, not out of ideology but out of self-interest. And the opposition will keep fracturing, unable to offer a credible alternative. There's a second scenario, though, and it's the one that keeps me up at night. What if Maduro decides to double down? What if he decides that the only way to secure his rule is to make Venezuela even more dependent on Russia and China? We're already seeing signs of this. In 2023, Venezuela signed a 20-year cooperation agreement with China, including billions in investments in oil and infrastructure. Russia, meanwhile, has sent military advisors and deepened its ties with the Venezuelan armed forces. If Maduro feels cornered, he could push Venezuela even further into the orbit of America's adversaries. And that would make the country not just untouchable, but a permanent thorn in Washington's side. The third scenario is the one everyone hopes for but no one believes: a negotiated transition. The US has hinted at this, offering sanctions relief in exchange for free elections. But here's the: Maduro has no incentive to negotiate. Why would he? He's already won. The opposition is weak, the military is loyal, and the international community is divided. The only way a negotiation works is if the US and its allies offer something Maduro can't refuse, like a full lifting of sanctions and a guarantee of immunity for him and his inner circle. And that's a non-starter for Washington. So we're stuck in a stalemate, where the only thing worse than the status quo is the alternative. Let me be: none of these scenarios are good. But the worst thing the US could do is keep pretending that there's a quick fix. Venezuela isn't Cuba. It's not Nicaragua. It's a country with a broken economy, a fractured society, and a leader who's proven far more resilient than anyone expected. The US can't bomb its way out of this. It can't sanction its way out of this. And it can't wish its way out of this. So what's the answer? It's not pretty. It's about managing the crisis, not solving it. It's about working with allies in Latin America to contain the fallout, like the mass exodus of Venezuelans, which has already destabilized countries like Colombia and Peru. It's about keeping the pressure on Maduro but also being realistic about what that pressure can achieve. And it's about accepting that Venezuela's future will be decided by Venezuelans, not by Washington, not by Moscow, and not by Beijing. The uncomfortable truth is that Venezuela is untouchable because the world has changed. The US can't impose its will like it used to. Russia and China are here to stay. And Maduro, for all his flaws, has outmaneuvered his enemies at every turn. The question isn't whether the US can afford to ignore Venezuela. The question is whether it can afford to keep pretending that it has the answers. And right now, the answer is no. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the death of a certain kind of American foreign policy. The kind that assumes that if you squeeze hard enough, regimes will crack. The kind that believes that if you declare someone a dictator loudly enough, the world will fall in line. That playbook worked in the 20th century, but it's failing now, and Venezuela is the perfect case study in why. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The US has spent the last 2 decades trying to reshape Latin America in its image, from the failed coup in Venezuela in 2002 to the soft coups in Honduras in 2009 and Bolivia in 2019. Each time, Washington assumed that if it pulled the right levers, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, even covert support for opposition groups, the target government would collapse. But Maduro didn't just survive, he thrived in the chaos. He turned US pressure into a rallying cry, framed himself as a David against the American Goliath, and used the sanctions to justify his own authoritarianism. The more the US pushed, the more he dug in. And now, after years of this, the US finds itself in a position where it can't escalate without risking a wider conflict, but it can't back down without looking weak. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no grand strategy for Venezuela because it never really had one. It had tactics, sanctions, recognition of Guaidó, oil embargoes, but no coherent plan for what comes in, and that's the problem with American foreign policy in the 21st century. It's reactive, not strategic. It's about scoring points, not solving problems. The US treated Venezuela like a chess piece, not a country, and now it's stuck with the consequences. So what are the alternatives? Let's start with the one no one in Washington wants to: engagement. Not the kind where you demand Maduro step down as a precondition for talks, but the kind where you sit down and negotiate without preconditions. The US did this with Iran in 2015, with Cuba in 2014, and even with North Korea in 2018. Why not Venezuela? Because the domestic politics are toxic. Any US president who tries to negotiate with Maduro will be accused of appeasement, of legitimizing a dictator. And in an election year, that's political suicide. But here's the: engagement doesn't mean surrender. It means recognizing that Maduro isn't going anywhere and that the only way to improve the lives of Venezuelans is to work with him, not against him. Then there's the military option, which is even more of a non-starter. The US has a long history of military interventions in Latin America, from Guatemala in 1954 to AMA in 1989. But those were different times. Today, the US is bogged down in Ukraine and the Middle East, and the American public has no appetite for another war. More importantly, a military intervention in Venezuela would be a logistical nightmare. The country is twice the size of Iraq, with a population of 28 million and a military that, while not as powerful as the US, is loyal to Maduro. And let's not forget that Russia and China would almost certainly respond, turning Venezuela into a proxy war. The last thing the US needs is another front in its global competition with Moscow and Beijing. That leaves containment, which is where we are now. The US can't fix Venezuela, but it can try to limit the damage. That means working with Colombia, Brazil, and other regional allies to manage the migrant crisis, which has already displaced more than 7 million Venezuelans. It means keeping sanctions in place but being smarter about them, targeting individuals, not the economy, to avoid further humanitarian suffering. And it means accepting that Venezuela's future will be decided by Venezuelans, not by Washington. But containment has its limits. It doesn't solve the underlying problem, which is that Maduro is still in power, the economy is still in shambles, and the opposition is still divided. And it doesn't address the bigger geopolitical shift that Venezuela, the decline of US influence in its own backyard. For decades, Latin America was Washington's playground. Now, it's a battleground for influence between the US, China, and Russia. And the US is losing. Let me give you an example. In 2019, the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, and more than 50 countries followed suit. Today, only a handful still recognize him. Meanwhile, China has become Venezuela's largest creditor, Russia has sent military advisors, and Iran has supplied oil tankers to bypass US sanctions. The US still has leverage, but it's not the only game in town anymore. And that's the real lesson: of the world is multipolar now, and the US can't just snap its fingers and expect everyone to fall in line. So where does that leave us? With a Venezuela that is, for all intents and purposes, untouchable. Not because Maduro is invincible, but because the costs of removing him are too high, and the alternatives are too uncertain. The US can keep pretending that it has a solution, but the longer it does, the more it risks looking like a power in decline. Or it can accept that Venezuela is a problem to be managed, not solved, and focus on limiting the fallout. That's not a satisfying answer, I know. But geopolitics isn't about satisfaction. It's about power, and right now, the power in Venezuela isn't in Washington. It's in Caracas, Moscow, and Beijing. And until that changes, Venezuela will remain untouchable. The question is whether the US can live with that, or whether it will keep chasing a solution that doesn't exist. My bet? It'll keep chasing. And that's the tragedy of it all.